Good evening, everyone. I'm Therese Acton Roberts, and I'm the coordinator of the Chris Walsh Center. And I'd like to welcome you all to join us this evening. We have an interesting session this evening. Before we get started, one of the things we do with all of our programming is we read our mission statement of the Chris Walsh Center to ground us. So the mission statement of the Chris Walsh Center is here to serve our community by providing information for families and educators about a continuum of educational supports available to students with disabilities, students who are gifted, and students with unmet needs. The center offers support workshops and other programming for families, educators, student support professionals, administrators, and advocates in Massachusetts. The center also conducts in scholarly research and provides educational preparation and professional development. If you haven't heard about our center before and you're new to the Chris Walsh Center, you can always check us out on our webpage, which is www.chriswalshcenter.org. And we have a lot of great resources. Tonight's session is brought to you on behalf of the Sudbury Foundation grant. And because of that, there is a survey that Natalie will put in the chat function, and we hope that you will put it in the chat function now, but we'll also put it at the end of the session. Take a couple of minutes to fill out the survey. We are able to do the stuff we do from grant funding, and these surveys help us get data for these grant fundings. This evening's session is being recorded. We ask that if you have questions while Becca is speaking, that you put your questions in the chat, and Natalie will come on in the last 10 to 15 minutes, and we'll ask the questions that you have for Becca in the chat. So we're constantly monitoring the chat throughout the evening, so feel free to pop your questions in at any time. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Becca. I'm going to read her bio. So Becca Gibson is an autistic and ADHD licensed independent clinical social worker, as well as the founder and owner of Wired Differently Therapy, a private practice serving clients in the state of Maryland and Massachusetts. After spending years working in special education, Becker began a career in social work with a specialization of helping neurodivergent couples, families, and neurodivergent individuals through a neurodiversity affirming lens. Becker's clinical work focuses on autistic and ADHDers, especially those who are considered gifted and twice exceptional. Excuse me. An intersection of LGBTQIA plus identities and neurodivergence. In addition to their work as a therapist, Becker provides professional development training, clinical consultations, and clinical supervision. With that, I'd like to turn the evening over to Becca. And I'm going to shut my camera off. And we look forward to hearing your presentation, Becca.
Thank you so much. Really excited. Okay. I think you know what you signed up for tonight, but just in case you didn't, I'll be talking a little bit about different presentations of ADHD in youth. I've outlined a brief agenda of what today's presentation is going to be like, just so you know the steps that we'll be going through. I think it's really important to have some terms just to ground us to the space. And also, I know I use a lot of language that people might not be familiar with. So take a breath. Some of the slides might have a lot of information on them. If you need to screenshot it, you can. And also, my email will be at the end if you have any follow-up questions about any of this stuff. Neurodiversity is a natural variation in human brains. And neurodivergent is describing a brain that just functions differently than what society expects or deems as normal, even though there's really no such thing as normal. Neurodiversity affirming is an approach to therapy, medical health, just the way that we orient to interacting with people, where the assumption is that there isn't anything wrong that needs to be fixed. It's just a natural variation, like we know about with neurodiversity. So biological sex is a binary attribute, usually male or female, and gender is a socially constructed attribute based on someone's own sense of femininity, masculinity, something in between that or outside of that. And for the purposes of the presentation today, a lot of the research on ADHD talks about gender and sex interchangeably, but I'm just going to be referring to sex when I talk about male and female, because they haven't really done a lot of research on gender. So what actually is ADHD? Simply, it is a variation in the brain, mainly characterized by a set of executive functioning differences or difficulties. This is our ability to focus our attention, control our impulses, plan, memorize, mostly with like working memory rather than the longer term memory, organize information, and prioritize. So as a social worker, we're guided to use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, which if you ever want to hear me talk about outside of this, I'm happy to tell you my thoughts about it, but it's important for diagnosing. So some traits of ADHD must be present according to the DSM-5 before age 12. That doesn't mean all of them, but at least some. The distinction is that these traits are not developmentally appropriate or not considered to be developmentally appropriate. They have to occur in multiple settings, although they might look differently in different settings. And with anything in the DSM, we're looking for what is called a functional impairment, which I don't love that language, but it basically is a way of saying there's challenges that other people don't have, challenges with how you get along with your peers, uh, how you perform academically, how you're able to take care of the stuff that you have to take care of at home. Uh, this could be like just brushing your teeth, right? And it's not explained better by something else. There's 3 presentations of ADHD. The first, which I think people are more familiar with, is hyperactive slash impulsive, well, predominantly, and then predominantly inattentive, and then a combined type, which is where there's both traits of that hyperactive impulsive type and also the inattentive type. So the one that I think you all know most probably are the kids that have trouble sitting still. There's a lot of movement. They might talk a lot. The asterisks I put, I think, are probably the most important. I think especially when we're looking at girls, one of the things that might not be caught as hyperactivity is like playing with your hair or playing with your jewelry. This is fidgeting. And it could be something related to anxiety, but often, especially when we see it in younger girls, this could be something that's going on. Also, a lot of talking excessively, even if there's not a lot of excessive movement, could be a sign. This is a kid who just has a hard time in silence. They might not just talk, they might hum or sing or share their internal monologue. Think of the person who walks around the house and they're saying like, oh, well, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to go wash my hands. And this is sort of that chatter that's already happening internally, but sort of comes outward more in this type. And with the inattentive type, which is probably more of what we're looking at today and what people know less about, is I guess we'd call it more subtle, but it's really just not as observable. This is maybe they have difficulty remembering to do things like write their name on a homework assignment, or they get really distracted. So it just takes them a long time to finish, but they finish. So it might not be as obvious that there's something going on. And there are these interesting paradoxes with ADHD, which we'll talk about as this goes on, where there's this avoidance of tasks that require sustained concentration, but there's also this really strong appreciation and interest in things that are different and interesting. And so sometimes those things can be in conflict, and it can be really confusing to look at, because you can't tell if someone's not paying attention because they don't want to pay attention versus they're not paying attention because they're distracted by so much that's happening in their brain at that time. So how common actually is an ADHD diagnosis? Numbers are a little bit higher now, but the thing about estimates is that they're always too low because this is just what's reported in like survey data. And it's also just who's diagnosed. And there's a lot of people who are not formally diagnosed. So about 5 to 10% of children between the ages of 2 and 17 have an ADHD diagnosis. And it's really important to note that like half of those kids aren't diagnosed until between the ages of 12 and 17. So usually this is when we start to see more significant challenges that maybe weren't as clear when someone was 7. But then when they go to middle school and the demands are different and the structure is different and there's less scaffolding, it's more of a concern. And also, boys are more than 2 times as likely to be diagnosed with ADHD in childhood, like at that age. Asian youth are more likely to be diagnosed autistic and actually don't have very representative diagnoses of ADHD, which is not an accurate thing. Like there are many people who do have ADHD who just are not diagnosed. And you see this number of 5 to 10% for children, and look that it's 3% of adults. It's not that adults aren't also ADHD, we are. It's that a lot of people don't know it. And ADHD is a lifespan condition. Like it doesn't go away, it's involved in our brains. And so the idea that ADHD traits will go away or will age out of them, it's actually more accurate to say that it just changes how it shows up. So where a kid might have had a hard time sitting down for a long period of time, well, as an adult, most of us are able to sit for at least some portion of time when we're expected to. But if mentally your brain can't hold on to a topic and it keeps jumping from thing to thing, you're still distracted. You're just in one place. So the average age for women to be diagnosed with ADHD is 36 to 38, which is way too old because we can diagnose this in people much younger than that. So that sex bias that we see in childhood between boys and girls being diagnosed narrows at that time. The theories behind that are that when you're an adult, you can actually talk about your internal experience. And for kids, when we're diagnosing, we're relying heavily on parent and teacher reports. So if a kid is quiet in class, they're probably not going to be marked as super inattentive or hyperactive. And if you have a kid that's getting up a lot, they probably will be. So whether or not the report is reflective of the actual ADHD traits or how much of a challenge they present for the kid, it is hard to say because there's differences in how teachers and parents report. Even different parents report differently, right? Which I guess makes sense because kids act differently around different parents. I also want to say that it's not that it's more common for people to be diagnosed with ADHD because ADHD is like bigger now. It's just that there's more awareness of it. And actually, it's not a new thing. The earliest descriptions of ADHD traits that I've read about date back to 1798, so it's not new at all. And you can start to notice ADHD traits generally between the ages of 3 and 6. So breaking down a little bit about the difference in diagnosis between that hyperactive impulsive type, the one you probably think of when you think of ADHD, versus the inattentive type. Looking through the list, you can see that the inattentive type is diagnosed later, more common in girls. Part of that is that there are coping and masking skills that girls develop. There's socialization that they have that can be played off as developmentally appropriate, even if it isn't. And what we generally see is that hyperactive impulsive type kid is sent for help if they're sent for help because they're behaviorally a problem, right? Someone says, this isn't working, you're disruptive, you need help. Whereas for the inattentive type, these are the kids that are developing anxiety and depression symptoms and then getting referred for treatment, and they're given antidepressants and wondering why nothing's changing because the antidepressant doesn't actually address the ADHD. Whereas these boys are more likely to be given stimulants. And for Black and Latinx youth, they're more likely to be like written in teacher reports as having these disruptive behavioral disorders and not just ADHD, which is really tied to that implicit bias that we have and impacts the way that people are able to access supports. So there is a lot that the DSM misses. This is a non-exhaustive list. ADHD is a dynamic disability, so it's variable in how it affects someone. Just because they're able to do something one day really well doesn't mean that they're going to be able to do it really well the next day. Like I mentioned, it is subjective, and there's this big focus on what it looks like to the outside observer rather than what is the internal experience for the person, which kids are not great at reporting. They're not going to be able to tell us very easily, like, oh, yeah, my brain's going really fast. Like some kids might be able to do that, and other kids can't. Also, there's no measure that's validated for older people, for older teens, for adults, for the elderly people. We're using the same diagnostic criteria as we do for a 5-year-old. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this leads to a lot of challenges and is probably also part of the reason why only 3% of adults have an ADHD diagnosis, even though we know 5 to 10% of those people are ADHD. There's sensory differences. And even though there is overlap between autism and ADHD, there's actually sensory differences even when there isn't autism. So just something to be mindful of, not for every kid. None of this is for every kid, but for some. And the attention is dysregulated. It's not that there isn't any attention. It's just where the attention goes, which gets tricky. So it's it's this consistently inconsistent thing because these kids can be really, really focused on something that interests them a lot. And it can seem really willful when they're having a hard time focusing on something for school that either is really hard or isn't as interesting. It can seem like they're not trying. And so we're already starting to, at this point, give messages to these kids to try harder, do better. Oh, like you could pay attention in this one area. Why can't you do it in this other one? And it's just really important to know that even if there are times when it is willful, it's not all the time, probably, at least not for an ADHDer. Some of it is like knowing what you have to do, but being unable to do it. And they're doing more research on the actual brain development and structure. And we see that there's lower levels of dopamine and noradrenaline in the in the brains of ADHDers. So this is our reward system. This is our motivation. This is our emotion regulation, our planning. Are you starting to notice a parallel between these lower levels of hormones and or the neurotransmitters and the traits that we looked at a couple slides ago? So again, ADHD can also look different in different settings based on the expectations in that setting. And we're also learning more about the impact of endocrine dysfunction, how different parts of menstrual cycle impact ADHD traits differently. So like in the luteal phase, which is like earlier on, we tend to see like lower executive functioning skills, lower mood, more irritability, more emotion dysregulation. And then later in the cycle, we see higher levels of executive functioning, better mood. And so if you're seeing those types of fluctuations in someone who has periods, that could be something that's going on. It could be a function of their ADHD. I'm going to show a brief clip from Bluey, and if you would indulge me, if you're interested, if you could just put in the chat anything that you see or hear that's an ADHD trait that you notice in this very brief clip.
And I couldn't sit still, as usual.
Come on, Jack. Can you sit still, mate?
Yes, Dad.
Did you remember your hat?
My hat. Where's my hat? Oh, look, I got it.
Jack, your hat?
I forgot it.
Ah, Jack. What are we going to do with you, mate?
There they go.
Jack.
Sorry, I forgot. I can't teach you your toe. I don't know.
Okay, I promise I'm gonna not depress you as much in a little bit. Yeah, I love Bluey too. Yeah, fidgeting, forgetting the hat, distracted by ghost, distracted by things outside the window. Yeah, exactly. Fighting, forgetful, not concentrating, some age appropriateness. Yeah. And also there's a younger sibling who doesn't view it as appropriate. And part of the reason I wanted to show this clip in particular, not just to get a sign of like what someone with a combined presentation might look like in 5 seconds, but also to get a sense of the kind of feedback that these kids get. So there are a lot of challenges and impact that all of that can have. So the core features of ADHD, which are really, really general, are kind of broken down into similar categories that we saw, that hyperactive, impulsive. The addition here, which I think is important, is that high distractibility for the inattentive, that internal hyperarousal. It doesn't just have to be that physical hyperactivity. It can be something that's happening in someone's brain. That impulsivity, which is distinct from hyperactivity in this model, and emotion dysregulation, which I don't know if you noticed, was not mentioned at all in the diagnostic criteria, but is a huge thing for ADHDers. There's feelings that are felt so deeply and so quickly that it can be really confusing and overwhelming for the kids and the adults. So these are usually the kids who have like no frustration tolerance, like they're doing okay, and then all of a sudden they're really, really upset or quitting something because it's too hard. There's this intense like physical pain, this vulnerability to rejection and criticism. It might be real rejection and criticism, or it could just be perceived, but the impact is the same. There's this overwhelm that comes from feelings, and it isn't just the feelings of that kid. It can be the feelings of people around that kid. And this has a huge impact on social relationships. As young kids, having some emotion dysregulation is developmentally appropriate. But what happens when these kids turn 8, 10, 15, and they're having the same frustration tolerance? it hugely impacts their peer relationships, which then activates this rejection sensitivity. And then it makes them more overwhelmed, and it sort of continues to bounce back and forth between these things. Emotion dysregulation, I don't think is talked about enough as a really prominent feature of ADHD. And if we're looking at how ADHD might look in the classroom, I think that there's these two kind of extremes, shall we say, that are often either discounted, assumed not to be ADHD, or like are attributed to something else. So this perfectionist, overachiever, these are the kids that raise their hand and want to participate, and doing well in school is really important to them, and they might do extra credit. And you might even, I know when I was young, I would get feedback from teachers to not raise my hand so much and to let other people have a turn, and tell you what that does for rejection sensitivity. It makes a kid who's academically engaged and trying to participate to keep engaged want to shut down, right? So when kids are highly gifted academically, they're overachievers. One, it's not really sustainable. Even if a kid is able to maintain this through middle and high school, even if they're able to get through college, there will come a time when the demand exceeds their capacity. It just happens because they're pushing past their limits and workload increases. There's so much more that's expected to be done independently. And we as ADHDers don't have those self-management skills inherently. And it's much harder to learn them as adults if you haven't been taught them as kids, which is part of why it's so important to identify this stuff when kids are young. So the message that this perfectionist receives is sort of, you're so smart, oh my gosh, which sounds like a compliment, but it ends up being a demand of achievement and success. And these kids can really quickly internalize the belief that they have to perform. And if they don't perform, it means that they can't do anything right. It means that there's something wrong with them. There's these really extreme beliefs that can come from, you're so smart, especially if you hear it a lot. And think about the flip side. We have this risk avoider underachiever who only tries on the things that they know they can do well on. Maybe they get A's on all of the tests, but they don't ever study and they don't ever do the homework because it's too much work. But the material is really obvious for them, or they don't do well on any of it. They just don't try. The message that these kids often receive is, you know, if you just tried, if you just applied yourself, you have so much potential, which also leads to these really, really painful beliefs of there's no point, because no matter how hard I try, people don't think I'm trying, and I'm going to fail it even when I do try. So why try? And you might see a combination of these traits or types. Like you have a kid that might be really good at like math, but not very good at English. Also, when we think about how ADHD might look at school, this could be a kid who's really able to like write a really good essay, but if you ask them to make an outline for it, they can't do it because it involves like organization and planning. But once they've written the essay, they can make the outline because the product's done, which is not what the outline is for, right? They might take longer to finish with tests, or they might take no time to finish. They might finish really quickly. Also, with some of that inattention, they might be making careless mistakes. So they could do like all of the math work right and get the wrong answer, or the other way around. So these are just some ways that ADHD can look. And I alluded to it, but speaking a little bit more explicitly about this, I don't like the word gifted, but gifted, twice exceptional kids, we call it a spiky profile because they have like these really high skills in some areas and really low skills in others. So if you have a kid who's working memory is like really low and they don't remember what they were supposed to do and their processing speed is really low, but they're hyperverbal and they can tell you like all of the right emotion words and it seems like they should be able to know it, but they just can't. It just doesn't match up. And so again, going to the paradoxes, of course it's easy to miss. And sometimes I think people will see gifted students and they assume, oh, you're having trouble paying attention because you're bored. And that might be an element of it, but it might not be the whole thing. They might be bored because they don't absorb the material because they're distracted. So that could be something to think about, notice. And these kids are at greater risk of having problems with their peers. There's some research that suggests that they are better at controlling that hyperactivity than attention, but that's for some kids. So shifting to how ADHD can look at home, these might be the kids who start a bunch of different chores or assignments, but don't actually finish them, or put their name on the paper and then they go up to get a snack. And then when they're think of like if you give a mouse a cookie, like everything that they think of reminds them of another thing. And so they go do the other thing. And then you come back and all of the stuff isn't done. So because of this distraction, we often see like assignments, chores taking way longer than what would be expected, what would take a non-ADHD kid to do. And it can feel kind of frustrating because there needs to be so much like oversight and management of these kids because they're going to get distracted if they don't have someone like kind of reminding them to stay on task. They're often, I think the thing about ADHD time is that it's now or not now. And there's no other time for ADHDers. So a lot of times you'll see these kids not aware of what time it is or how long something takes. And so they get started with something and then they're not ready when they're supposed to be ready. Or on the flip side, they have a lot of anxiety about not being ready on time. So they just sit and don't do anything. And then they wait until the thing that they have to do. This like chronic feeling of boredom, being both overstimulated and understimulated at the same time, like needing more input, but having too much to process and not being able to have any more. And it might look like changing hobbies. They might go from playing on a sports team for a number of years to not wanting to do it anymore. And I think there's a couple of reasons that this could be the case, right? Because a kid might not want to play on a sports team anymore because they're starting to have these peer challenges because they're made fun of for their low frustration tolerance. And then it feels like there's no point in doing it, so I don't want to do it anymore. Or it could be too challenging to keep going with something. I was really good at the beginner level of one thing, and then I tried to move on to the intermediate and I couldn't do it. Or we just like trying new things, right? So it could be this sort of combination of things. And I think getting curious with these kids about why they want to change, not telling them to keep with something that they're not interested in, but like figure out like, is the reason they're dropping out of something because they really aren't interested anymore? Is there something ADHD related? There's difficulty with these unstructured time tasks that need to be self-initiated. So like think if you have a time to study, like, okay, well, I could study anytime, so I just don't do it, right? Which is different than, oh, this homework worksheet is due by 2 p.m. on Friday. Then you know when that's due, you know when you have to do it, you have to plan some sort of time around that. And you might see more like mindless snacking. We see some like binge eating. Part of that is the dopamine seek, right? Or forgetting to eat because they get distracted or they're hyper focused on something that's interesting to them. And really just knowing that this isn't necessarily the way that one of these kids wants to be, right? The basic tasks are hard. Think about like something boring, like brushing your teeth. There's sensory challenges potentially for teeth brushing. It's not an engaging activity. It's short. It's easy to get distracted when you're doing it. And as a result, ADHD people tend to have higher rates of cavities. I mean, it's a correlation. I can't say it's a cause, but it would make sense. Gentle reminder that ADHD is genetic with an 80% heritability rate, and they have done family, twin, and adoption studies. And it's pretty clear that most ADHD kids have at least one ADHD parent. 1 out of 4 still seems pretty low to me. But again, we're working off of who's diagnosed. And I really want to stress that ADHD is not caused by poor parenting. However, because there are often ADHD adults, parents who aren't diagnosed, they might not have the emotion regulation or self-management skills to support their kids who are struggling with emotion regulation and self-management as effectively as someone who has those skills, like an ADHDer who's supported. So my gentle encouragement is if you think you might have ADHD, get support for it because it doesn't have to be as hard and it helps with the other domains. This is just some labels that tend to get assigned to ADHDers. The truth is that ADHDers are usually putting in a lot of effort trying to pay attention, trying to not get distracted, trying to remember. Like, think about that Jack from Bluey clip. But the effort isn't always matched by the outcome. And that message ends up getting internalized that they need to try harder or that there's something wrong with them for not being able to do it, especially if they look at their peers and their peers are able to kind of do these things and it doesn't take the same amount of effort. It's hard not to kind of take that in. So 70 to 80% of ADHDers have at least one co-occurring condition. I don't know how many of these are things that people are born with versus things that they develop because they have unsupported ADHD when they're younger. But is part of why we want to look at learning and language disabilities and also like giftedness when we have ADHD traits that we see in kids, because a learning disability could make some of these things so much harder, and it doesn't necessarily have to, because if we know what that disability is, we can actually provide supports around it. Also, there's like not a ton of research around like the transgender experience of and how transgender people have ADHD traits, because it's mostly been focused on this like boys versus girls. But when they've done studies of youth who have gender dysphoria, they have higher rates of ADHD. So also be mindful that you might see this in transgender, gender diverse youth as well as a co-occurrence. Take a breath. This is my most depressing slide, I think. Looking at ADHD across the lifespan, and the big asterisk is that when ADHD goes unsupported, there is a drastic shift in consequences to unsupported ADHD when these kids hit middle and high school. If you remember, about half of kids aren't diagnosed until then. And the longer that ADHDers go without understanding why things might be more challenging for them, the greater the negative impact. As you can see, for those of us that don't get diagnosed until they're 30 or older, like me, you end up having more issues with like people take more long-term disability, they have more chronic pain, are in intimate partner violent relationships. There's so many consequences that can happen really from that messaging that like you're just not doing it right. But There are totally ways to support ADHDers, and it's not all that hopeless when we're able to identify it and support them. So ADHDers have some challenges in their executive functioning. We also have amazing strengths. This is a small list. Being able to really shift how kids see themselves by how we deliver feedback is an essential part of improving their outcomes, because ADHDers receive so much corrective feedback from parents, teachers, peers. And actually, we found that strengthening self-esteem around their strengths is something that makes a big difference, not just because people feel good when they know what their strengths are, but also ADHDers don't tend to evaluate all of their like traits in the same way. And so they might view their struggles like with peers or with school like really strongly, but they might not have the same evaluation of how they are in other areas. So being able to help amplify the areas they already don't feel as bad about can help kind of offset the negative feedback they might be receiving in the other areas. So reframing ADHD differences is really important. Ed Hallowell and John Rady had proposed the concept of this like variable attention stimulus trait as like less pathologizing than deficit disorder. I'm a big fan of Ross Green. One of the resources that I have at the end is his book, The Explosive Child. And he talks about this whole idea that kids do well if they can. And so if a kid's not doing well, it's usually a signal that they can't for whatever reason. And that's true even when we are looking at what might be deemed an oppositional behavior. Remembering that this is dysregulation of attention and emotion, not deficiency. And non-ADHDers have what has been coined like an importance-based nervous system. So being able to engage in a task because it's important either to that person or to people around them. It's important to the teacher. It's important to my mom. And so that significance or a reward for doing it or a consequence for not doing it, that matters to the importance-based nervous system and is sufficient, and they're able to then engage in tasks because they're important, even if it's not important to them directly. But ADHDers don't have an importance-based nervous system. We have an interest-based nervous system. So I'm gonna share about the experiential definition of ADHD, which was proposed by Bill Dodson. And then I'll show this clip from Abbott Elementary. So again, ADHD is genetic and brain-based. We already know neurotransmitter chemicals, hormones are different, structural wiring, different. Already different than the DSM diagnosis, right? Engagement is variable, and it's based on this interest-based nervous system, which relies on interest, challenge, novelty, and urgency. So is it interesting to me, the topic, or what is connected to the topic? Is it challenging? Is it different? Is it new? Is it exciting? And is there a time that it needs to get done by? We need deadlines. So there might be an ad here. I'm hoping there isn't. This clip is sort of, I wanted to show this kid who has some ADHD traits in class. And I would like for you to kind of notice the way that the teacher and the peers respond to this kid's ADHD traits, and also the shift when this teacher starts adjusting the instruction for an interest-based nervous system.
Being a farmer is
I
we're
knew it.
located in a rural area, which I love, but we're part of a worldwide.
Okay, now does anybody remember what was in this container before? Aaron, go for it.
iceberg.
I will accept iceberg. Now, there was an ice cube in this container before, right?
Mom.
Michael, why are you yelling in my class? Is your mom here right now?
Mr. Eddie, you silly.
No, I'm not. So there was an ice cube in here before, but now there's just water. What do we think happened to that ice cube?
I love bingo.
This isn't the first time Micah has disrupted my class. From what I understand, he's obsessed with a TV show about Australian dogs. Bluish or something. I don't know. It doesn't matter. What matters is I've tried everything to keep him in line and nothing works. It's gotten to the point where even his classmates are annoyed. Do you know how hard it is to annoy a first grader?
Bingo. 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 Bingo.
Everybody, eyes up here, right? Bluey. The show is called Bluey. You know, rain is an example of water in its liquid state.
Bluey is from down under.
Micah, if you keep distracting your classmates, you're going to leave me with no other choice but to send you to the principal's office. Now, we already know that ice is a solid, but water is a...
Have you ever been down under?
Micah, I didn't want to have to do this, but you leave me with no choice. Gather your things. You're going to see Principal Coleman. Now, ice cube melted and then turned into water.
Here's the
We left
shift.
that water in the sun and then it evaporated. Now, does anyone know? Huh? What? What was that, Bluey? Uh-huh. Yeah. Bluey, you so crazy. Bluey is so funny. But she said that she knows what state the evaporated water is in. Does anyone else? Okay, Micah, come on up.
Now you know he don't know.
Okay. Now, is the water a solid, a liquid, or a gas?
Wrong.
Not quite, buddy. But that's okay. Thank you for trying. Now, does anybody else want to give it a go?
Oh, no. So, a little hard to watch at the beginning, but he shifts the instruction and the kid starts to pay attention. And it doesn't hurt anyone else in the class. They were engaged too. So I think that that's one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that no one gets hurt from relying on an interest-based nervous system. Like you can target it and everyone's going to pay attention. I do want to note that teacher has a lot of work to do around how he helps this kid have different peer relationships, but that's a conversation for another day. I do want to name that there are some really concrete benefits of medication for ADHD kids. It's considered like a frontline treatment. And so stimulants work for about 70 to 80% of kids. And the earlier that they're able to start them actually reduces that, if you remember that timeline of depressive things of the outcomes, it reduces the secondary outcomes that we see as kids age. And there's not serious long-term effects that research has found at all. And if there's anxiety about like taking a stimulant, non-stimulants are also effective, not quite in the same way, but still effective. And actually taking ADHD medication shows improvements long-term in all of these areas, being able to finish school well, mood disorders, being able to have a job, having less accidents, having less car crashes. So and medication's only like a piece, right? Pills don't teach skills, I think is what I have been told, right? But if you want to teach skills, understanding and acceptance of one's brain and their own neurodivergence is huge, and actually helping peers to accept differences as naturally occurring, right? A neurodiversity affirming approach to the classroom or to extracurriculars is more effective than teaching an ADHD kid what they call social skills. We work with self-esteem and emotion regulation and ways to reduce shame, managing the rejection sensitivity, learning how to like support your own interest-based nervous system, and organizational skills are hugely important. Some specific strategies for school, which I have this like sort of ADHD feedback cycle where, as we saw in like that clip, right, there's the behavior, then they get feedback, the peers have a reaction, and then there's sort of this internalization of like shame, and then the cycle starts again. And so we want to support kids by breaking the cycle, right? It doesn't mean don't give corrective feedback, but there are other ways that it can be done. You want to talk with the kids separately. So maybe there's a hand signal you can give, or if the kid's okay with like a physical prompt, like a touch on the shoulder, then that can be an effective way too. But drawing attention in front of the whole class is one of the hardest things because the kid's already engaging in a behavior that either they're distracted or they're acting out or they're crying, and it's already going to have a reaction. So normalizing the differences really makes a difference for how peers view them. And just like a quick reminder that the reason reward punishment systems don't work is because ADHDers have one of the reasons. ADHDers don't have an importance-based nervous system. So the systems that are actually set up in schools to support kids, and they say that it's for kids like this, like PBIS, actually end up having like worse long-term outcomes. So just something to keep in mind. And I do have like a proposal. I don't know why there's this circle in the middle. My proposal is universal design for learning. It's a whole strategy that I didn't make up, which basically just says if you make the classroom accessible for everyone, you don't have to do anything differently for the kids who think differently and learn differently. You show multiple means of representation. You have multiple methods of learning. Think about like having manipulatives in the classroom and not just teaching instruction one way. Like this is supportive for all students, and it's supportive for the kids who aren't diagnosed yet too, right? Having like everyone have the ability to kind of get up and fidget means that you don't have one kid who's not fidgeting or not using a sensory accommodation because they don't want to be the only one, right? Some strategies for home. Routine. School has structure built into it, and home does not, which is part of what makes home harder in a lot of ways, especially on like weekends. Think about like spring break or summer break, which is coming up. Having a routine, you can have variability in that routine to sort of target that that need for novelty. We also don't remember that things are there. Remember like that lower working memory. So see-through storage containers, one of the best hacks. And labeling things. If you have drawers, labeling with a photo, right? Adding that visual cue for these kids. And then they know where things go. Part of the reason why things don't get put away is because if I put it away, I won't remember where it is. I won't remember I have it, and I won't be able to find it. But having a place for things, helping these kids really break down like what those tasks are, how they can look, helps them be able to implement those strategies as they get older and the demands change. And the ask how, not why. How can I help? Not why did you do it? You know, there's usually not a good answer. You don't know why you did something, but how can I help? Like I think about a kid who gets told to clean their room, but what does that even mean, clean my room? So breaking down the tasks for them. Okay, well, you're gonna want to pick up all the trash on the floor and throw it out. Great. That's a concrete thing. Now I know what to do. helping to give those steps, having it written out so they can kind of check it off. These are all things that build the organizational and executive functioning skills that they don't have. And I wanted to end with this slide by ADHD comic Danny Donovan, because we talked about this whole presentation being breaking stereotypes and this idea that a kid has to be an extroverted white young boy who's like very fidgety and hyperactive and doesn't do well in school and he just can't pay attention. It's just not an accurate picture of all of the different ways that ADHD can look. So I hope that you're able to kind of take with you at least a couple of things that get you curious about either maybe kids that you know who might need some extra supports or some strategies that you might be able to look into implementing, so we can make sure that the people who are not getting diagnosed until their 30s with ADHD and then having all of those challenges that we don't need to have, get the support that they need now when they're younger. So I'm so glad that we're here, and I'm going to stop sharing. I have like a bunch of resource and reference slides, but I sent them all to Natalie to share with you all. So I'm not going to waste your time with that. And they may want to please the teacher, or if the teacher doesn't get them, they don't make any effort. Yeah. I'm just reading this. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't. I thought you were done speaking a little bit of that.
I thought I was too.
Sorry. So I am going to start popping those things in the chat. I currently have a couple questions, but I'm going to share the resources first, and then if anybody else has questions, please feel free to send them along, and I will read them off for Becca to answer for us. So all of these links that I'm putting in now are the ones that Becca sent me. She made these lovely PDFs of all of these resources for us from her presentation today, from their presentation today. Excuse me. And Becca, the email you've been sending things to me from, is that the email you'd like to share? Okay. Okay, so the question that I have is, and you had a slide on this, but what makes neurodiversity affirming counseling different from maybe traditional therapy or counseling or traditional approaches to ADHD?
Yeah, so I think when we think about traditional counseling, like talk therapy, one of the most common ways, one of the most common approaches is like cognitive behavioral therapy, the sort of like, if you think different, you can do different, right? Like your thoughts impact how you feel, which impacts like what you do. So if you change what you do, like how you think, it can change what you do, and you can change how you feel. And that's all like really helpful for some people. But the reality is that a lot of us have brains that don't fit that. And if you're having feelings of being criticized because you're always told to stop talking, then trying to convince yourself that the thought that you had about, am I talking too much, isn't real, is kind of like gaslighting yourself. Like you're telling yourself that this thing isn't happening when it very clearly is. So a neurodiversity affirming approach really says, look, these are differences. And one thing is, we're not trying to like make it go away. Like we're not trying to make it so you're not ADHD, right? As you saw on the strengths slide, like there's a lot of really cool stuff that comes alongside being neurodivergent in some of these ways. But there are challenges. So it's sort of, how can we support those challenges rather than trying to like fix or change? Like it's not like a medical problem. It's just a way that someone is. So it creates a space for people to like kind of address that shame that is so central to some of those negative outcomes that we see for ADHDers by saying, you know what, like, yeah, it doesn't work. Like it really tends to not work. We want to accept people and their differences as they are, and then check and see like, okay, but does it work for you that you're distracted and not able to get done laundry and you have to redo it every time, or that it takes you 6 hours to finish your homework? Like, or do you want support around that?
Awesome. Thank you so much. We did have another question. Do you see a lot of similar traits between ADHD and autism? And then there'll be one more after that. I'll ask the follow-up question next.
Yeah, like some of it overlaps and some of it is vastly different. So we tend to see like some sensory differences in both ADHD and autism. We see executive functioning challenges, that emotion dysregulation in both ADHD and autism. But with ADHD, there tends to be more of that internal like speed. Not, and my big caveat for all of this really is that like every person's brain is different, like whether they're ADHD, autistic, more neuronormative or not. But like for an autistic person, we're more likely to see wanting to stay in routine, wanting to have the same structure. And if someone's ADHD or ADHD and autistic, we're more likely to see like getting bored with what the routine is, like a need for some sameness, but also difference. And so there's overlap, but this is part of the reason why it's really important to have people who know what they're looking at when they're doing like a full evaluation. This is part of why we talk about getting evaluated by people who are neurodiversity affirming or who do have lived experience as being ADHD and or autistic, because there's those internal experiences that you have that don't necessarily align with like diagnostic criteria. Like if you look at the criteria for ADHD or autism and you're like, oh, can someone look me in the eye? Like, sure. But if like some people can, but it doesn't mean that they're comfortable with it. It doesn't mean they get it. It doesn't mean they like it. And so there's so much more exploration that needs to be done to really be able to like tease that apart. And the reality is that ADHD and autism occur together a lot. And it used to be that if you had one, you couldn't be diagnosed with the other back in the DSM-4. So it's a newer change that, oh, we're actually seeing that they're different and you see them in the same people sometimes, but there are these distinct kind of differences.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Follow-up question, can OCD be just another form of ADHD?
No. So OCD also has a lot of overlap, really, and they're all forms of neurodivergence. So think like if you have this hyperconnectivity of brain neurons, right? It's not that quick of a leap to have connectivity in multiple areas. But the thing about OCD that makes it more distinctive and also can be really hard to tease apart, and actually OCD is diagnosed like 7 to 12 years late. Like most people who have OCD are diagnosed much, much older because it's assumed to be something else. And so if there's even like a suspicion of OCD, you really want to screen for it early because the supports around it are very, very different. And certain medications are like really, really helpful for OCD in a way that like other medications aren't. But OCD, really what we're looking at is it's not just like you're seeing both a compulsion and a behavior. And part of what makes that hard and why it goes missed is because it could be a mental compulsion. So it could be like a mental checking that someone's doing that isn't externalized at all, and no one might even know it's happening. So it's another one where you really need to learn more about that person's internal experience, which again is really hard when you're working with kids because they don't really know how to describe what's happening for them.
So the next question, I think there's, I'm still reading the rest of it, but there's a question and then kind of a personal story. So I'm going to ask the question part and then, I'll allow you to read the personal story part in the chat. So why, no matter what I do, they don't learn how to use their executive functions? Or yeah, I think that's the gist of the question.
So I feel like I need to read the rest of it to like get the context of because there's so many things that could be going on. Like I would want to know, is this just ADHD or are there other disabilities that are impacting the ability to retain the information? What are the actual like reminder supports that are being put in place to scaffold? Like I'm really big on everything should be like in writing and like visible, and I'm like they're still going to need reminders. And actually I want to slow down and pause and just be like, this sounds so hard. I just like wanted to like name like it is exhausting to be executive functioning for a family of 7. I'm like, I can't executive function for just those of us that are like in this home, right? So I just kind of wanted to name like, of course you're overwhelmed. That's so much to be put on you. And in terms of like the remembering and the prompting, I mean, I think part of it is helping them figure out what systems like work for them. And what I think it is part of what can be exhausting is that it might be a different system for each kid. And so you might find something that works really well for one of them, but the other ones, it doesn't. So trying to figure out like, what are the things that are getting in the way of the executive functioning? Is it a problem with the working memory and they literally just don't remember? Is it that they get bored partway through and they don't want to do it? Because I think the way that we target it changes based on sort of what the barriers are. And I really like the collaborative problem solving approach, which is one of the resources. Again, I had quoted Ross Green during the presentation, but this idea of sitting down with the kid and saying, okay, like, let's figure out the problem. I'm going to come up with what I think the solutions are. You're going to come up with what you think the solutions are. And then we come together and we see what works. Because I'd also want to know, what are there times when it has worked and then it stopped working? Because often what I find when I think about like this novelty is that like a system will work for a while, sometimes like 2 weeks, sometimes like 2 months, and then eventually that interest-based nervous system kicks in and it gets bored and it needs something new. So I usually recommend creating like 2 or 3 systems that are ready to go. So when one stops working, you already have one in place to kind of shift to. But I think part of it's hard because if you're relying on like a lot of things like I think a lot of us are taught like, well, just set a timer, but it can actually be counterintuitive because what happens is if you're just setting a timer, then it's just a timer that you're going to ignore. And then every time you hear the timer, you're actually less likely to respond to it. So I usually tell people like not to set like alerts and reminders unless they're going to be able to shift. Because otherwise it becomes just another thing to ignore.
I also put, we had one of our board members, so one of the Chris Walsh Center board members, Courtney Edmond, does work with executive functioning, and she did a 5-part series for us that is on our YouTube channel. So I put the playlist to that in the chat for you as well.
I also like executive function coaching. If you're able to offload and have someone else teach the skills so that you're not the one to have to do it, I think is really can save you and save them. And I'll also say that executive function coaching is not like therapy. Like it really is about teaching these skills, and it's meant to be short term. It's meant to be like an intervention that gets put in place to help you create the system that the ADHD brain can't create or struggles to create, and then be gone. It's like, here is your system. Now you implement it.
Becca, do you mind if I also share a resource on, I listened to a really great podcast the other day from the Neurodiversity podcast on UDL, on Universal Design for Learning. Is it okay with you if I pop that in the chat too?
Oh my gosh, please. I very much am a strong advocate for UDL. I think it would eliminate a lot of the challenges that we see in like the IEP 504 process and make classrooms more accessible in general for teachers and students. I can't speak highly enough about UDL. And one of the resources I put in was for CAST, which has information on UDL and also like trainings and stuff. If people are interested in learning more about how they might start to implement like UDL.
And there's just a couple more comments. The book you mentioned, The Explosive Child, has good collaborative tactics. Yes, that's Ross Green. Non-traditional parenting methods that can work. And then thank you. It's not an easy answer for sure. I've been looking for answers for some time. So
I'm clearly not the one like in my family that's not ADHD, but my sister's that one in her family, and I know how hard that is for her. I feel for her. She loves a lot of us.
Well, I just wanted to jump on. I think we've made it through all of our questions. I want to thank you so much for your presentation today. It's amazing. We'll be sharing this out with our replay. So for all of you guys, feel free to share the resource off. But we want to make sure you guys have the opportunity to fill out the survey. Natalie just put the survey link back in the chat. So we'd really appreciate the feedback. Again, the replay, if it's not out tomorrow, it will be out on Monday. But we look forward. We want to thank Becca for being here, and again, thank the Sudbury Foundation for making this possible, and thank all of you for joining us tonight. And with that, I'm gonna stop the recording.